everyone online as well. I'm Eric Wakin. I'm the Deputy Director of the Hoover Institution and the Everett and Jane Hauk Director of our spectacular library and archives. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event, which is noted in its title, aims to, quote, reveal the Third Reich and the inner lives of extremists through the lens of one of our most recent new acquisitions, the Gerd Heidemann collection. It's one of the most remarkable private archives documenting the history of the Nazi Party that's ever been acquired by any university archive. This event also is the inaugural event of our Archives Uncovered series, which highlights newly acquired collections, newly described collections, and talks about how we connect them to researchers. In this case and others, also to filmmakers, tracing the role of history and archives together. Let me share a few quick thank yous. Thank you to our director, Dr. Condoleezza Rice, for her support of the Library and Archives and the priority she has placed on our history initiatives at the Hoover Institution. Also, the board of directors and all the donors and supporters of the institution. Everything we do is privately funded through the generosity of donors. Finally, I want to thank the speakers and subject matter experts that I'm going to introduce in a moment, and my colleagues, the staff of the institution, for setting up this room, the digital space, and so on. I do like to just say a few words about the institution. You know, we were founded as the Hoover War Library in 1919, and from that, founded by Herbert Hoover, the 31st President of the United States and a member of the first graduating class of Stanford, we've grown to become the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace. On the public policy side, we're dedicated to advancing freedom, and the Public Policy Center supports about 200 different, more than 200 actually, fellows researching everything from emerging technologies to history and everything in between. And it's one of the great growths of what Mr. Hoover wanted the institution to be, to grow and to be more than what he called a mere library. And we do bring scholars together in that way. At the same time, the Library and Archives dates back to the First World War, of course, when Mr. Hoover founded the institution, and consists of over 1 million books and over 6,000 archival collections. I like to mention that Mr. Hoover founded the institution with a telegram that just said, essentially, collect material on war. And that was his deed of gift, with a $50,000 gift in 1919. In today's dollars, rough, just under $1 million. Today, our deeds of gifts are a lot different and more intense. So I like to say we're very unique in being both a library and archives and a think tank, a public policy center. And it's very, very unusual. And the Library and Archives does an enormous amount of activities in addition to collect. We provide scholarships to people. We publish with the series, the Hoover Stanford series on authoritarian regimes, and we publish with the Hoover Press. We bring in scholars, as I said, through fellowships. We have events like this to bring material out to the public, and we try to do everything we can to both bring people into the collections and push knowledge of the collections out in various ways. So I'm really grateful for your being here to participate in today's event. And we've been working to get the Heidemann collection for many, many, many years, and finally got it over the last couple of years, thanks to the efforts of a number of people, including the first person I'm going to introduce, which is Dr. Katharina Friedla, who's a research fellow and the Taube Family Curator for European Collections at Hoover. Before coming to Hoover, Dr. Friedla worked as an associate professor, a translator, and a scientific advisor for universities and institutions in Germany, Israel, and Poland. Katharina has published a number of books and many articles on the Holocaust, on nationalism, on identity politics, and forced migration in 20th century Europe. And as I said, she was instrumental in building the relationship with the Heidemanns to make sure the collection came here. In the middle, Thomas Weber is professor of history and international affairs at the University of Aberdeen, as well as a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. Thomas is an expert on extremism, national and international order, and democratic breakdown and resilience. He has taught or held fellowships at Harvard, Institute for Advanced Study of Princeton, Penn, and Chicago. Among his books are Hitler's First War and Becoming Hitler, The Making of a Nazi. And we're grateful for his help in bringing the collection to Hoover also. And on my immediate right, Foucault de Caux is an award-winning Dutch documentary filmmaker. For 15 years, he worked as an international correspondent, covering a number of stories and interviewing people like Tariq Aziz, Nelson Mandela, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Mikhail Gorbachev. After leaving the news and current affairs world, he transitioned to documentary filmmaking. His three-part series, The Downing of the SS von Imhoff, recounts the killing of 650 German civilians by a group of Dutch sailors in 1942. But for his new project, Decaux and his crew are retracing the 1979 journey of German journalist Heidemann and former SS General Karl Wolff as they travel to La Paz, Bolivia to meet Klaus Barbie. The travel logs, the audio tapes, and the photographs from Heidemann's archive serve as the foundation for the upcoming documentary, The Barbie Tapes. With that, please give a warm welcome to Katarina, Thomas, and Foke.
So, Eric, thank you very much for your kind introduction. We are really delighted to welcome all of those here in the room and also our audience online. Before we start, I have a couple of housekeeping notes to make. First, we will start our discussion, which will last approximately between 30 to 40 minutes. Then we're gonna hand over to Eric, who will moderate our Q&A session. Afterward, Professor Norman Neymark will deliver his final and closing remarks. And last but not least, I want to invite everyone to our reception, which will take place after our event. So before we gonna move to our conversation on the inner lives of extremists, I call it a DNA of Nazi perpetrators. First of all, we want to give you a little bit of background and talk about the creator of that collection, Gerd Heidemann, as well as give you some brief overview of the content of the collection. And maybe also say a few words about our acquisition efforts, our work on site in Hamburg with my wonderful team and Thomas to transfer this collection to Hoover. So Thomas, you're one of the best experts who have a profound knowledge of the collection. You are also one of the few scientists who've got access to some materials from Gerd Heidemann archive a few years ago. So what would you say about Gerd Heidemann? What character how would you characterize him?
He really was an adventurer. I mean, he passed away in December at the age of, I think, 93. He was really made and formed by war himself. He had grown up in Nazi Germany, in Hamburg. He was, I think, 14 when the war ended. And basically for the rest of his life, he was trying to make sense of his childhood, I think. And as a result of that, in many ways, he did what Herbert Hoover always wanted us to do. He really was chronicling war and revolution for the rest of his life, and really in two roles, both as a journalist. So he became a kind of star journalist for the most famous German magazine. He was sent for decades every time somewhere a plane went down or war happened. He was being sent there. He was on the next plane there. He took risks that no one else did, and lived to tell the tale, or lived to bring home the photographs. Here we see a photograph that he took in the mid-1960s in Africa, for which he won the World Press Award. He took crazy risks to, for instance, the Middle East. He rescued also the life of one of his colleagues. So this was his own work as a journalist, as a reporter, but he also started in a very much in a tradition of Hoover, to accumulate material himself. In a way, the collection really spans the entire human history from literally the beginnings of time until the day he died, but with a special focus precisely on the period covered by the Hoover collections, namely from 1914 to the present. This is also why, when about 10 years ago I first got access to this collection, and I realized that there was a maybe willingness to think about where there should be a permanent home, I immediately thought Hoover would just be the perfect collection, really, for two reasons. Because again, he spent all his life to do what Herbert Hoover wanted to do. But it's also a collection that really does allow us, maybe like no other collection that was in private hands, to look at the inner lives of extremists, and of which we know far too little. We know far too little about what was going on in the heads of Nazi perpetrators, of other perpetrators, because when they were in courtrooms, they would always play down their role, and here there would have anything boast about it. So in that sense, this brings us to the other side of Hoover. It's an amazing collection that actually allows us to understand extremism, political processes, and therefore to figure out what are the ideas that define freedom and how can freedom be defended. So that is why I immediately thought this really has to come to Hoover.
Okay, you met Gerd Heidemann just a few months ago when you went together with Thomas to Hamburg to conduct an interview with him and to film his basement. So I think that was probably your first meeting with Gerd Heidemann. How was your impression? I'm curious to hear about your experiences with Gerd Heidemann.
Well, we met him in, I think it was like 5 days before he passed, 92. And I thought still he was a very energetic man, still full of stories. And not just the basement where you see a picture here, even his house was full of these black folders, all this material that he collected. I was impressed.
So maybe now let's talk about our efforts to get this collection into Hoover, and just to give you an impression about the size. I mean, we're talking about more than 7,000 binders of materials of different kinds, photographs, documents. And that was probably our first impression when we have entered the basement. I mean, you have imagined a place, a very shady, dusty basement in Hamburg. So I must say, for me, when I for the first time met Gerd Heidemann, so Thomas introduced me to him. It was I think in spring 2022. I was really shocked. And I was also afraid because of this confrontation, because I knew already what kind of material do I have to expect in this basement. But I was really afraid because of this amount of Nazi documentation. But after several hours of conversation and having, some look into the material, I just realized, wow, this is really amazing archive, and it's really just start to talk about the transfer. The path to get this collection to Hoover was very long, very turbulent. We have negotiated, I think, about more than 1 year. Gerd Heidemann was an extremely difficult and complex personality, but we finally, were able to reach an agreement and started to transfer the collection in the summer of 2023. So my wonderful colleagues, Talia Olszewski, head of the department, of the description department, as well as Colin Stenson and Ryan Gazal, the heads of the preservation team, joined me in Hamburg. And we have been working for more than 2 weeks in this basement. It was summer, very hot, dusty basement without, no windows, fresh air. So that was really a challenge. But we were able to pack everything. And you can see on this picture. So this is only, a fragment of this size. So that was really amazing. And that was, we call it a mammoth collection. So this one photo is this track that's still in Hamburg. So we moved the entire material, the entire archive to a secure storage in Hamburg before we were able to ship it to California, just to give you an impression to ship containers. And and those are my colleagues when they reopened the crates and the boxes when the collection reached Hoover. And just 4 months after our expedition, we just learned that this basement was damaged. So it was flooded. So we just realized, wow, how timely we were. And we can actually say that that was definitely a collection at risk. So we are very happy that we managed to get it here on time. And now I think before we're gonna give you some insights into entire content of the collection, I would start with a fragment of Buke's documentary he's currently working on.
Februar 1941 in Amsterdam. 800.000 Menschen. 800.000. Ganz Amsterdam stand auf dem Kopf. Sehen? Da wurden wir eingesetzt. Ein Bataillon SS. Und die liefen dann mit Diplom von diesen verfluchten früheren SS-Mann, den Prinz Bernhard von der Reiter-SS, der sich unter dem Rock seiner Frau versteckte da. Dem hatten sie doch angeboten, er soll mitmachen. Stattdessen ist der Kerl nach England abgehauen. Ne? Der trug doch immer so eine Nelke.
In your opinion, what makes this archive so unique, so important?
Well, first for me as a Dutch filmmaker, the archive is interesting because here you have on the right Klaus Barbie and on the left SS General Karl Wolff meeting each other in a hotel in La Paz and talking about the razzias in February 41 in Amsterdam. And that is by itself unique because we've never heard from the perpetrator side about that two-day Russia where the Nazis took about 400 men from their homes in a Jewish quarter of the Dutch capital. So although that has been widely published in Holland, books written about, this is the first time that we get a perspective from Barbie's side. Yeah. So that makes it, for me as a Dutch filmmaker, very interesting. On the other hand, the archive, and especially this trip of Barbie and Wolff in the summer of '79, is so well documented by Heidemann. It's audio tapes, but it's also diaries. He made transcripts of more than 17 hours of audio of conversation between these two men. And for a filmmaker, well, it's a gift.
I think we should very briefly just mention for the audience. So in the collection, there's material that Gerd Heidemann collected. So where he convinced people that they would part with their private papers. And it was particularly, again, this guy, Karl Wolff, who was a door opener and who helped to facilitate the acquisition of a lot of these kind of private papers that people still had at home. But he also interviewed particularly in the 1970s, a lot of perpetrators that were still alive, again, facilitated primarily by Karl Wolff. And what we're now talking about is this trip in 1979 when they went to South America trying to find Mengele, the Auschwitz doctor, and Bormann, both of whom were dead, but they didn't know that. And so they were trying to find those two men. And in the process, undercover, they traveled through 6 countries in South America and interviewed maybe 20 or 20 to 25 Nazis living in South America about that time, and they taped absolutely everything. And so Klaus Barbie is just one of those stories, and it is just amazing what we learn there about their motivations and so on.
Yep.
I think it's really, fascinating. But I do remember during my second meeting with Gerd Heidemann in Hamburg, he just handed over to me a bunch of documents in Hebrew and said that, you know what, Katarina, you're probably one of the first people I'm talking about with. For many, many years, I worked for the Israeli Foreign Intelligence Service, Mossad. And now today we know that, and of course you knew I read Hebrew, so I translated those correspondence, and then I started to search in Israel for additional documentation, and just recently declassified files from the Mossad archive, and it was clear at some point that Heidemann and Karl Wolf, they were not alone during their trip. So there was all over the time there was one person from the Mossad who followed their trip and also documented everything. So that's very, very interesting.
And I think it's also important to point out here is because there's this kind of public image of Gerd Heidemann. If you have heard about him, it would be typically through the 1983 Hitler Diary scandal, where the guy who had forged these diaries had pitched them to Gerd Heidemann. He had fallen for the forgery. And then the story that is being left is also, particularly in Germany, when he died, a lot of the obituaries were about. It was all about the Hitler diaries, and then they might have mentioned, and he was traveling to South America with his as general. But I think in order to understand Gerd Heidemann, we also have to understand he wasn't just traveling there with Gerd Heidemann. He was also traveling there with Mossad. And in many ways, Gerd Heidemann was, in a way, so honorable that he didn't talk about his involvement of Mossad until a few days before his death himself publicly, precisely because he thought, I can't do it. So in a way, he accepted that he would be painted this way. But I think now we can really be able to tell a very different story. And this, in a way, will also be part of Foucault's documentary that will be aired in May, because so what happened during this last visit, just before his death, we'd initially arranged that we would interview him, but then he felt he was too sick, he couldn't do it. I met up with him anyway, but then, as Foucault said, he suddenly, when he realized he could talk about it, he perked up again. It was the last time that he was kind of really lively. And then he said, just record. In a way, it was just, then with this, we recorded the final interview with him, where for the first time he also talked himself about how for 20 years he worked together with Mossad.
I was surprised that it was difficult to find an answer why, because through his life he's been painted as a sort of a Nazi friend. Why he never explained that he worked for Mossad. I mean, in his defense, that would painted a complete different picture of his character, personality.
I think the answer is because he thought he was not allowed to. I mean, the first time when he found out that I had told Hoover that he had worked for Mossad, at that time, this was a few years ago, he always went ballistic, because he said, well, I'm not supposed to talk about it. And I said, yes, but I found out a different way, so I'm not quoting you. And we also know, and in a way, there's a parallel story about German domestic secret services, because he was approached many years ago by the East German Secret Service, by the Stasi, and he was approached, and so he then went back to West Germany and talked to the domestic West German Secret Service, and he said, I've just been approached by the Stasi, what should I do? And they told him, go along with it and report to us. And that story at some point came out. Then there were these newspaper stories, I think in the 90s, about how Gerd Heidemann wasn't just a Nazi, how he was also working for the Stasi, which of course doesn't quite go together. And yet Gerd Heidemann at that point, he could have just said, well, look, I was doing this because the West German democratic liberal Secret Service told me to do so, but he felt he was not allowed to do so.
Yeah. So if you look at the picture, I mean, Klaus Barbie on the right doesn't know that Gerd Heidemann, who's also in the room, who took the picture, is a journalist. And Carl Wolf, who is traveling with Heidemann through South America, doesn't know that Heidemann works for Mossad. So, yeah.
Why did you choose this topic? Why Klaus Barbie?
Well, first, as I explained, for me as a Dutch filmmaker and his role in Amsterdam, working for the Sicherheitspolizei for a year and a half, not much has been published about that in my country. So that's for my audience really interesting. Also, Barbie is, I think, well, the more known name of the, I think, 6 people they met in South America, like Walter Rauff and the others. And the quality of the tapes. I mean, this was all recorded in a hotel room, well, Heidemann did a great job. I mean, technically, if you listen to the audio, it's fascinating. Yeah. And we were surprised. We were filming in La Paz 3 weeks ago, and went to the same Sheraton hotel, and the room and everything, there's like exactly in the same shape as it was in '79, except for that beautiful wallpaper that disappeared. Yeah, I think I have pictures. We have a picture of that. No, okay.
Already
In the clip, yes.
So it just, I'm wondering, I just remember the first time when I've got the digitized tapes of the entire interview with Klaus Barbie. And my aim was just to prove the transcript, which was attached to that in German, to figure out if the quality is good enough. I must say, I spent the whole weekend working with those tapes, and at the very beginning, I was so disturbed. I couldn't do that because I think even if I'm an academic, I worked on Holocaust for more than 20 years, and of course I must admit that I focus on the other perspective, on the Jewish perspective, and of course I knew a lot of Nazi documentation, which of course I included into my research. I worked, I translated a lot of Nazi documentation from trials in Krakow 47, Auschwitz trial in Frankfurt in the 60s, and Eichmann trial, of course. But just diving into this, as I said, DNA of a perpetrator who is openly talking about the crimes, it was a very difficult experience to me.
Yeah, and I think what is interesting is that, as you mentioned also earlier, that this is a first-person perspective from Barbie, for example, on what happened in Amsterdam. But he is, instead of making his role smaller, he is boasting towards General Wolf, who is his superior in rank, obviously. And for example, when he talks about the razzias in Amsterdam, which took place over 2 days, he brags that it was like 3 tough weeks of house-to-house battle in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam. So he makes his role bigger than it actually was, compared to, as you said before, in a courtroom or in a trial like Nuremberg, where they would make their role a lot smaller.
Just recently I came back to this great set of interviews which Clodfelter did with dozens of perpetrators for his masterpiece Shoah. He has been working for 14 years on this documentary, and that's for me a comparable set of documentation, especially interviews.
Mm-hmm.
But when I came back to hear those interviews again, I just realized, well, this is totally other quality of this perpetrator's narrative.
Right. Right.
Because while Lanzmann was not able to get all the information, they were still, they tried to defend themselves. They repeated all over again. They had no clue about the atrocities. They were not at all involved in the crimes. So this, I think, this is really unique material, which shows a totally different perspective.
Yeah, and also the atmosphere in the room. I mean, they address the others by their SS rank. That's chilling.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I think, and we of course also, as we've just, I guess, heard, we're not just learning about through these recordings about what happened before 1945, but also about how these guys lived after 1945, how they dealt with this past, how they, in a way, they reconfigured their National Socialism. They did not break with National Socialism. They did not associate from National Socialism, and yet it's a different kind of National Socialism. And I think that is also really an absolutely fascinating story to tell. And there's about, I think, 800 tapes, not just from South America, in the collection. The South America stuff is particularly rich, but there's so much else. So, for instance, another one that is really important is a recording from the 1970s with Bruno Streckenbach, who was the head of personnel of the agency within the SS in charge of the implementation of the final solution. And a few weeks before his death from cancer, he spoke very openly about what he knew, and he shares with Gerd Heidemann what Heydrich and Himmler had told him about orders that Hitler had issued. Of course, we need to take all these claims just as the one where Barbie is boasting with a grain of salt. We need to look at this critically. But here we get as close as we can get, I think, to kind of the inner lives of these perpetrators, including where kind of there's potential to that we learn new things, for instance, about the evolution of the final solution.
What I find, as Bobby is really open about the crimes he committed and boasts to Wolf, they don't talk about the Holocaust.
Yeah, that is in a way strange. Is there, in a way, this goes back to the kind of what I said about the reconfiguration of the National Socialism, because you could somehow also think if they're amongst themselves, they would somehow be proud of the Holocaust, because of course from the 1930s and 1940s perspectives, it's like a very dark bounded rationality of Hitler and these National Socialists. They would say, well, look, we're doing an honorable thing here. These are the Jews are the originators and the agents of the greatest crisis Europe and Germany has faced since antiquity. So we're doing something noble here. That is no longer there. There we have, so they're celebrating the old days, they're celebrating Hitler, they're celebrating National Socialism, but they kind of have pushed the Holocaust out, or rather the Holocaust becomes something that someone else within the SS did. In a way, it's absolutely absurd. These are, particularly in the case of Karl Wolf, he can't get much higher ranking than he is. He was for a while the adjutant to Himmler. And yet he somewhere said, Holocaust, nothing to do with me.
I also found a few interviews with survivors who settled after the war in Bolivia and lived in the past. I think that I could identify, and it was so interesting because the witnesses are talking about their, confrontation with Barbie in one of the coffee shop, in bakery, or on the streets.
Oh, he was very public.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because he was very present. I mean, in the public, and
Yeah, he was a member of the La Paz club. There was a German club where he often frequented restaurants and bars. He played piano. I mean, he was seen around La Paz for at least 2 decades.
And indeed, it is in these clubs that they were perpetrators and victims were in the same clubs and were kind of trying to avoid each other, but not very successfully. So,
well, also, I mean, I thought that was really telling that when Heidemann and Wolf arrive at the airport in La Paz, and they talk about this on the tapes, that they are happy to see Klaus Barbie there as their host, and it's almost like Barbie is running the show at the airport. I mean, Wolf says, thank God nobody checked our passport, and some security man came up to me and said, well, don't you worry, Mr. General, we'll make sure that nobody will hear about your visit to Bolivia. It will be under the radar, no press. And that tells a bit about the influence that Barbie had in the dictatorship. Yeah.
I mean, as you can see, the material is just so rich, and in a way, we're just kind of giving you through the prism of the South America trip a taste of what else there is, what everyone, of course, not just us, but everyone from around the world can do if they come to Hoover to use the collection. But even for South America, we're trying to help Foucault a little bit with this program. We thought this is about this and that's it, but we just realized there's so much more, and so much more to explore, and not just more, but so many questions that we could be raising with that, and we certainly feel very tempted to do precisely that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're running out of time, and maybe we can close with the last fragment of your documentary.
Yeah, I'm still in the process of editing, but these are two short clips.
Basement in Hamburg. Gerd Heidemann, I think he enjoyed the big life for a time. He was a star journalist for Stern. He was one of their star reporters, and he could live the big life.
Heidemann heeft een grenzeloze fascinatie voor alles wat met nazi's en het Derde Rijk te maken heeft. Een obsessie, zo zou je het ook kunnen noemen. In deze kelder in het centrum van Hamburg verzamelt hij zoveel nazi-zooi dat de collectie uitgroeit tot het grootste particuliere nazi-archief ter wereld.
I think that is one part of it, that he enjoyed the big life. Another part was that he thought that he could combine that with being a journalist and finding out for the public some of the biggest stories of his time.
Hier in die muffe kelder kwam professor Weber zo'n groot en meeslepend verhaal op het spoor. 9 cassettebandjes met vele uren aan gesprekken tussen mijn vriend Klaus Barbie en de SS-generaal Karl Wolf. Opnamen die Heidemann nooit heeft gepubliceerd.
Das war so 54, 55, 56. Eines Tages kam dieser Fahrer weg. Und dann war er völlig blau. Und dann redet er da vom Führer. Und das passte mir nicht, weil wenn einer besoffen ist, der Führer ist für uns auch heute noch immer ein Ideal, über den man nicht so reden kann.
What is really striking is that these men are still believers. They ultimately still have faith. When it comes to first-person perspective of top Nazis and of extremists, we generally have got to rely on interviews that were conducted after 1945 in courtrooms. And of course, there people were generally, with very few exceptions, had a real interest to downplay their role. And here we have first-person perspectives of people where they really present themselves the way they want to be seen. And that is extremely important in trying to understand extremism both then and now.
Just before I take the first question, I want to again thank Katerina, Tomas, and Foucault for this. And just to amplify what they said, this collection is really one of the most incredible we've acquired in the last many decades. Started meeting with Heidemann in 2014, really accelerated in the last 2 years, and it's a collection of collections, like a fund of funds. If you do investment, it's as they said, Thomas Wolfe, Hitler's personal photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, glass plate negatives. It's 7,000 binders of material. Some of it direct you throw out, but we keep, but it's just articles. It's really incredibly rich. An important thing from the archives perspective, from scholarship's perspective, is that it will provide research material for many, many, many scholars for many decades. And that's the important thing, to be preserved for history and not sold to some collector and hidden away. So thank you so much for your work on this. Now, any questions? Happy to entertain them right here. First, wait for the microphones if you could, and then Lauren will tell me when we have some online as well.
Hi, thank you so much for this interesting talk. I just had a quick question about, you talk about Heidemann's reputation as kind of a friend to the Nazis and how he didn't discuss his work with Mossad during his lifetime. It seems like that would be potentially beneficial in his endeavors when trying to gather these collections, these materials from extremists that he had to garner trust from. I'm just wondering if you have any insight about that reputation building he had to pursue to gain access to these materials.
Yes, that is precisely what he said. I mean, I've had actually quite over the years, he often said this to me. I mean, he was extremely kind of hurt by this reputation, and in many ways was in different ways, because he thought he couldn't talk about Mossad and so on. He was trying to repair his reputation, not maybe in the most clever of ways, the way he was doing it. But he kept on saying is that, why do people say this? Don't they realize I was a journalist? I had to actually go along with the story. So if now people just listen into some conversation I have with X, they can't just look at one sentence. I said that. I mean, I was there in a role. They need to look at my entire life. Or they would say, well, look, don't they realize that I was already in the 1950s, I was already trying to find judges who have actually never been, who had never to Nazi judges, who had never to answer for their deeds. So he was extremely hurt and didn't understand why people didn't realize that as a journalist, he had to do this in order to build up that kind of trust.
Hi, thank you all for really fascinating discussion. I'm wondering if any or all of you could comment on the motivation first of Heidemann. Was it just because he was a journalist and wanted, I mean, specifically in going to South America and interviewing these Nazi figures, was it because it was a big story and he was a journalist? Was he deeply anti-fascist, anti-Nazi? Was it the idea of Mossad to do this? You know, so what he thought he was doing, and then equally curious is, what did Wolfe think was going on? How was it that he thought it was a good idea to bring this man to interview these people for posterity?
So I think it's both. It's so complex. I think this Mossad story plays a very big role in this trip, because when I just got these files, they handed over to me. So there was the whole documentation. Mossad was looking for Mengele and for Bormann probably at that time. So there was the full evidence of information on Joseph Mengele, fingerprints, photos, etc., etc. But there was also, as far as I remember, Thomas, you can probably elaborate a little bit more on that. There was an idea to create a series of articles and probably also a book on these stories of former Nazis who fled to South America. And Karl Wolfe played a crucial role in that, because he opened the doors for Heidemann in South America. So he knew all the people there. And he was like, yeah, he gave a credit, right? So
in a way, I find it most difficult to answer your question as with regards to Karl Wolfe, because Karl Wolfe, even though he didn't know about Mossad, or he does not appear to have known about Mossad, he was double-crossing his former comrades. And what I don't understand is, why would Karl Karl Wolff do this? Why would he think it's okay to kind of deceive people like Klaus Barbie and so on? This would totally go against kind of SAS code of honor. It would have meant before an instance that. Why would he do that? And I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it's something to do with the fact that these were people who had been significant, who had been influential. And now suddenly after the war, they're either criminals or no one pays attention to him. So this might have been, again, to do something. It might have to do some kind of quest for significance. As with regards to Heidemann, I think maybe the best way to answer your question is actually not to look at Heidemann's several year-long quest for these Nazis, but to look at his previous quest for someone who's mostly forgotten now, but who was a very famous adventure writer early on, B. Traven, who was this adventure writer and whose books were adapted for film, for TV, but no one knew who is B. Traven and where does he live. They knew he's somewhere in Mexico, and there were all these rumors who this was. And at some point in the 1960s, Heidemann is asked to follow up this new lead, that this might have been this left-wing revolutionary from Munich who had fled Munich in 1919 after having been condemned to death. And he then also can't let go. He basically spends the next 6, 7, 8 years, long after his magazines had let go, pursuing the story, writing a book about this and so on. So I think this was a 6-7-year quest for a left-wing revolutionary, and that then shifted to becoming this quest for these Nazis. So I think if we want to understand these obsessive quest, we have to understand his personality, and that he really goes for, when he goes for a story and he thinks he can do it, he will not stop.
Your question online? Yeah.
We have a question online from Stanley. Can the panelists tell us more about how Heidemann was able to develop friendships with both Barbie and Wolff? Why would they agree to talk with him? The specifics of this meeting would be of great interest. How did he present himself so as to integrate himself with these Nazis?
Well, I think, interestingly, a part of his collection, which is not here, was the motor yacht Karin Zwei, which used to be Hermann Goering's yacht. And he bought that, and it was in the Hamburg harbor, and he lived on that ship. And that's why he met, or he invited a lot of former SSers and officers like General Monke, like Karl Wolff, to come to the ship, drink beer, and talk about the old days, and that being the basis also for a book that he wanted to write. So that's where the foundation really lies for his relationship with Wolff. Also, the idea for the South America trip, as I understood it, was born on the Karin Zwei.
Yeah, although so he initially gets to know Karl Wolff when he is researching a story about Mussolini and Mussolini's death. Well, not just Mussolini's death, also how Mussolini was freed by this SS unit in the mountains. So in that context, he first has contact with Karl Wolff. Gerd Heidemann was very talented to build up then a kind of trusting relationship with anyone. But to explain, but I think it's interesting to look at the kind of the cover story for South America, because that in a way is a very different one from the one of the Karin Zwei. And this might go to Stanley's question. In South America, the cover story was that he was just helping Karl Wolff to write his memoirs. And so Karl Wolff would basically say, look, I'm traveling to South America and we're doing this and that, but I'm writing my memoirs, and here is Gerd Heidemann, and he's helping me. He's one of ours. And that is why they trusted him and why they would speak openly. The story in on the Karen Spy, which is just as important, and again, this is where things are born and so on, is a different one. In there's no disguise. There, Gerd Heidemann is saying, look, I'm working on a book where I bring together former perpetrators and former victims, or the governor of Spandau Prison, the American governor of Spandau Prison. He all brings them together. He says, look, I'm recording this now. And he asked them to sign release forms afterwards.
Thanks. So I can only imagine that these guys, by virtue of being recorded, they know this is for posterity. But I wonder if on the tapes they ever talk about what was said at Nuremberg, which was also on the record for all posterity. I mean, do they ever address the trials?
I do not remember such a fragment in those tapes. I think we have to bear in mind at that time in the 70s, we had no internet, no access. I mean, they didn't even know the perpetrators in South America. That Gerd Heidemann is a very well-known journalist for the Stern magazine, right? So I think that's the question of a transmission of a knowledge. I think at that time, especially in South America, it was very hard to get those informations, right, from the maybe from newspapers, but I do not remember that they engaged with this topic and talked about the trials, specifically in Nuremberg or probably later in Auschwitz, where Streckenbach was also interrogated, right?
Yeah, I mean, Streckenbach gave testimony at the Auschwitz trial.
Yes.
And of course, he had been tried. Of course, also Karl Wolff, of course, he had already spent 4 years in prison, and he had been tried. And if I remember correctly here, but this is not South America, there's a lot of other material about Karl Wolff. I mean, in a way, the Karl Wolff collection is within the course probably the biggest one, because there also is memoirs, letters, and so on. So there, I think there are conversations also about justice or injustice from their perspective, about having to answer for those kind of things. But in a way, it's never so central.
The author was a journalist, and when I think of Germany, I think of a magazine called Der Spiegel, which is a fairly conservative, like our version of Time magazine. But was this author working for a magazine called Stern, which is it more sensationalist than Der Spiegel? Would he appeal to a different audience that's looking for a story, kind of like Woodward and Bernstein, rather than just straight, reporting? In other words, was his dimension to increase his readership, his clientele, his audience?
Spiegel and Stern magazines both were and are still weekly magazines, but of course there was a lot of competition. And I totally agree that Stern was more, focused on politics and history, but more in sensational manner. Yeah.
Although, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
I can't really think of an American equivalent of Stern, because in a way it's not like Newsweek or Time, because in a way there's lots of glossy pictures. There might be also celebrity articles in there, but then in between you have very serious articles, maybe with lots of images and so on, but they have a lot of scoops. They break a lot of political scandals. So it's very serious journalism. This is in a way also why the Hitler Diary scandal was so damaging, because in a way they had for about 40 years at that time to build up this reputation to be kind of a serious magazine for an extremely wide audience, that both serious and intelligent people, but also very, very, well, also still serious, but ordinary people would read. And that in a way was kind of destroyed by the Hitler Diary scandal.
So definitely the Spiegel was not a conservative newspaper. I mean, at least that's not considered to be. I'm from Germany originally. I used to read Spiegel every week. And the Hitler Diaries came out about 2 years after I finished my high school and I started studying, which was really what Heidemann is known for in Germany is, you know, the public is just that. I think all the stuff that you really showed you, which is great, fantastic, is really something that's absolutely worth preserving. But here's my question, right? So he was heavily criticized. So two names are very much known, Kujau and Heidemann, right? Because Kujau was a forger who did the Hitler Diaries, and for years he was known, and Heidemann himself. Well, he was criticized because he didn't really check on the diaries, right? He got him, and then he basically more or less published him. He never had a second check on it. Why do you know? And he never did anything big afterwards. Why do you trust him? I mean, is the sources that you have, the documentation that you have, is this trustworthy information, all of it, or has the Hitler Diary also an aspect of maybe he's just a little careless on some things?
Only one remark on what you said. It's not entirely true that those fakes were not proved. They were sent to, I think, one expert in Switzerland, another in Great Britain, and the third inspection or review was still going on at the Bundesarchiv. The specialists, they were working on that. But this turn, the publishers and also Heidemann probably, they pushed, to publish it already. So they've already had these two reviews, which were positive, that those are, real diaries. And this third review was still, work in progress. And so that was the disaster for this scandal, because they didn't wait. So that's the remark on what you said. So there were attempts to prove the authenticity of this material.
He had actually. Gerd Heidemann had actually been diligent for several years on these issues. He had actually often, when he bought something, he went particularly to this expert in Switzerland and had things tested and verified. He was also, when we first started talking to him, he was very open about things that we might want to be careful with. I mean, he said, look, there are one or two things where I'm still not sure. Be careful with that material. He has been very transparent. Can we be absolutely sure that absolutely nothing is of a questionable origin? No. But the same would be true if you go to any archive in the world. I mean, if you go to the US National Archives, you might also find material that maybe shouldn't be there. So I think in a way we have to kind of treat the collection in that sense like any other did. And I would also say I think at some point during the Hitler Diary scandal, he kind of wanted to believe that this was not forged. However, he was still telling people, let's wait for the last test. So in a way, it was at that point his editors who said, no, let's go for it. And they afterwards threw him under the bus and got this reputation. I don't think that this reputation that he was this careless guy who didn't want anything to be checked is an accurate one, even though that's still, you're right, in Germany, that's the public perception.
Thanks. Thanks very much. Katerina.
And now let me to introduce to you Professor Norman Neymark. I know, I'm sure everybody knows him, but I just do my formality. And Professor Norman Neymark is a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution. He's also the Robbery and Florence MacDonald Professor Emeritus of Eastern European Studies and a senior fellow of Stanford's Freeman Spogli Institute. Professor Neymark is an expert in modern Eastern European and Russian history. He's the author of critically acclaimed volumes, The Russians in Germany, The History of the Soviet Zone of Occupation, 1945-1949, Stalin's Genocides, and in his recent book, Genocide, A World History, Professor Neymark examines the main episodes in the history of genocide from the beginning of human history into the present. We're really delighted to have you here, Norman. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Katerina, for that nice introduction, and also to allow me to speak a few words here at the end of this session, which has been just wonderful. Thank you all for your contributions. This is an incredibly important moment. I mean, the moment was a few days ago, I think, when the archive was actually open for use. These are extremely important papers for the history of Nazi Germany, of Hitler, of the Holocaust, of post-war Germany, indeed, even of the post-war world. So I'm very grateful on behalf of world scholarship to note this moment, and I hope you will note it as well. A collection like this is sort of a once-in-a-lifetime thing. As Eric already noted, it's a huge thing for the Hoover Archive, which already has many such collections. By the way, it's also important for our students, who are increasingly able to use the archive and are accustomed to being in the archive, not just for the graduate students, new PhD dissertations, but also for undergraduates who can make their way through the German. And there are more and more of them. I want to thank the principals involved in this, and that is Eric Waken, the director of the Library and Archives, Katerina, who you've already met, the curator of the European collections, and Thomas Weber, who's spent a lot of time looking at and testing these archives, just as he has said, and as you have heard. They have done something really quite marvelous here. First of all, they've brought the collection to Hoover. This is not easy, and Katerina already gave you a sense of how difficult these kinds of things can be. I've been involved on the periphery of the acquisition of many collections over my last 50 years associated with Stanford, and it's really hard work and difficult work and complex work, and it doesn't always succeed. We're very grateful to them for this succeeding. And the second thing to say is this collection could have easily been dispersed or bought by a private collector and hidden forever. So it's open, right? It's open now to scholars, to researchers, to our students, and for a very long time to come, as Eric indicated. So let's give them a round of applause for their efforts. I want to reiterate how important this collection is to the study of Nazism and the Holocaust in particular. I mean, you may well be aware for the first decades after 1945, people paid very little attention to the Holocaust in general. There weren't any scholarly works until 1961, when Raoul Hilberg wrote his famous book on the destruction of European Jews. And even then, he had a lot of trouble publishing that book. He published that book, by the way, using almost strictly Nazi documents, not the kinds of firsthand materials that are available, for example, in this collection. It was a very slow process for historians to begin to accept that you could take testimonies from ex-Nazis or still Nazis or Jews, as real historical documentation for what happened. It took a long time, really until the early 1990s in some ways, for historians to take these so-called ego documents and say, wait a minute, they really teach us something about the past that official documents don't. I mean, you will recall maybe that the Holocaust Museum didn't open until 1993, and that Steven Spielberg's collection of testimonies by Holocaust survivors didn't start until 1994. So this is all fairly recent. So it's wonderful to have these ego documents here, and they will become very, very important then to the further development of the historiography. Now, some of you know that I've been involved in the kind of subfield of genocide studies, charming field, right, of genocide studies over the past 30 years or so. And a subfield of that that's developed fairly recently is something called perpetrator studies. There's even a journal of perpetrator studies if you want to publish your article there, Bert. Anyway, to learn about perpetrators, to discover their motivations, to figure out who they are is not just important, to understanding Nazis, is important to understanding perpetrators everywhere. Perpetrators who kill, and there are some here in these documentations, perpetrators who, send people off to the camps and trains, and there are some here in these collections, and just, collaborators, people who went along with Nazi plans. And, these kinds of perpetrators are involved in all kinds of genocides. So psychologists, psychiatrists, criminologists, sociologists, and others will use this material, as well as historians who are trying to reconstruct the past. Here we have all of this kinds of material. Now, it's true, and people have brought it up, memories will deceive. We know that these guys, who are interviewed in the 70s, are going to distort the past. But at the same time, and Thomas has said it well, you check it against original documents, you double check, with other kinds of documentation. And when you do that, you get extraordinary insights into their motivations, into their psychology, and what it means, to undertake these kinds of actions. Memory deceives. We know this from our own experience with our own lives. But, checked again against reality in other kinds of documentations, we can learn a lot. Now, there's far more to be said about this collection, or better, collections. It's many collections, really, in one. You've seen some of the materials. Let me just mention quickly those on post-war Germany, which for me, are totally fascinating. This has to do, by the way, with American intelligence in Germany after the war, the CIC, which is basically army counterintelligence, working together with circles of Nazis, including many of the people we're talking about today, for their own purposes. I mean, this is long before Mossad, I think, is involved. American intelligence is working with these people and helping them, in many cases, get out of Europe to South America through these so-called rat lines. And the rat lines, come also via the Vatican. So we've got Washington and the Vatican, the Holy of Holies, helping get Nazis out of Europe. And this is documented very well in these collections. Also, you may recall that Americans are taking ex-Nazi scientists and weapons specialists and moving them directly to the United States to engage then in the development of armaments for the coming Cold War. So there's all kinds of really, really interesting stuff here about the formation of German society after the war, the formation of the state. You mentioned already this controversy about Hitler's diaries, which is not just a kind of obscure historical controversy. It makes up really the character of post-war German society. It's an extremely important, as you know, a piece of post-war German cultural history. So in conclusion, we have a treasure trove of documents, a fantastic, how many lives do I have? Not that many, but a few years anyway, to spend some time in this collection. It fits perfectly the mission of the Hoover as an institution to study war, revolution, and peace. And it's a huge attainment, as you've seen today, for the archives, for Hoover, and for scholarship as a whole. So thank you very much. I appreciate your attention.
Thanks, Norman, for those wonderful words about the archives and the collection. Thanks, everyone on the stage. Thank you in the audience. We're going to break now and have our reception across the street, across the way. Thanks very much.